4 lemons versus 31. Same tree, same pot, 2 seasons apart. The only thing that changed was that I stopped following the modern citrus fertilizer label and started following a feeding schedule from a 1955 USDA bulletin I found in a university archive. That bulletin was written before the citrus industry consolidated in the late 60s, and the method in it was deliberately dropped from extension recommendations because it required a per plant attention no commercial grower could afford. Backyard gardeners could afford it just fine, but by then nobody was writing for backyard gardeners. I tested it. I have the records. Stay with me to the end because there is one specific phase in that protocol, a roughly 14-day window in late winter, that the modern fertilizer schedule completely skips, and it is where almost all the extra fruit comes from. I want to be honest with you about how I found this. I was not hunting for a buried protocol. I was deep in the NC State Extension Archive trying to answer a much smaller question. What root zone temperature does a citrus tree actually need before it can pull phosphorus out of the soil? That question sent me into the older bulletins, the ones the archive keeps on microfilm, and in plain manila folders most people never request. And tucked in there, dated 1955, I found a USDA home and garden style bulletin written specifically for backyard citrus owners, not commercial growers, backyard owners with a tree on a porch, or in a sunroom, or sitting in a pot by the kitchen window. Here is the part that matters. That bulletin was written before the citrus industry consolidated. By 1968, California and Florida citrus production had collapsed into a small handful of grower cooperatives, Sunkist, and a few others holding most of the volume. And the moment that consolidation happened, the extension services that had been writing for both audiences pivoted hard toward the commercial one. Standardized NPK schedules, fertigation rates per acre, application timing keyed to a calendar a tractor could follow. By roughly 1970, the backyard-tuned protocols had quietly disappeared from extension publications. Nobody banned them. Nobody held a meeting to vote them out. Extension stopped writing for backyard owners because backyard owners were not paying for the research anymore. Most folks with a Meyer lemon get 4 to 8 pieces of fruit a year and assume that is just what container citrus does. I am here to tell you that is a measurement problem, not a luck problem. The protocol that solved it has been sitting on a shelf for 55 years. All right, let us walk through what is actually in that bulletin. The 1955 protocol is a 3-phase feeding calendar. That part by itself is not unusual. What is unusual is that the phases are not keyed to calendar dates. They are keyed to root zone temperature. The bulletin tells you to start feeding when the soil in the pot crosses a specific threshold, not when the page on your wall calendar says March. Phase A is the late winter pre-bloom phase. Low rate feeding, heavy on phosphorus and micronutrients, kelp, bone meal, a touch of boron, a touch of zinc. The total amount of fertilizer is small. The timing is everything. Phase B is bloom and fruit set. A balanced feed, moderate nitrogen, moderate phosphorus, moderate potassium, plus a calcium foliar spray on the new fruit while the cells are still dividing. The calcium piece matters because once that fruit cell wall is built, it cannot be repaired. Calcium has to be there during division, not after. Phase C runs from fruit swell through harvest. Potassium emphasis. Nitrogen drops back hard. The bulletin is explicit on this point. Too much nitrogen in phase C, and the tree pushes new leaves at the expense of the fruit it already has. The bulletin actually uses the phrase rob the fruit, which I thought was a nice plain way to put it. That is the structure. 3 phases, temperature triggered, micronutrient aware. And that is exactly the kind of plan that does not survive when extension recommendations get rewritten for commercial fertigation, because a tractor cannot wait on a thermometer. Here is the science. Citrus roots cannot take up phosphorus efficiently below about 55 degrees Fahrenheit at the root zone. That is not opinion. That is a temperature threshold confirmed in plant physiology research. And it is exactly why the 1955 bulletin keys its first feeding to soil temp instead of a calendar date. If you feed before the soil hits 55, the phosphorus sits in the pot and runs out the bottom the next time you water. The tree never gets it. The second piece is something most home gardeners do not know about: flower bud differentiation. What I mean by that is the citrus tree decides how many flowers it is going to set before you ever see a bloom. The decision happens inside the bud, weeks earlier, while the tree is still looking dormant to your eye. If the tree is hungry at that exact moment, specifically hungry for phosphorus and a couple of trace minerals, it sets a small number of flowers. If it is fed correctly during that window, it sets a larger number. By the time you see white flowers on the tree, the count is already locked. Third piece, photosynthate partitioning. That is the chemistry teacher term for where the plant decides to put the sugar it made. A citrus tree in a 15-gallon pot has a finite root mass and a finite leaf canopy. There is only so much sugar to go around. The 1955 protocol is built around making sure that sugar moves into fruit instead of into excess vegetative growth. Modern container citrus advice does not respect that math because the same fertilizer label has to work for everyone, including someone with a tree in the ground in Florida. That is the mechanism. And the mechanism is exactly the kind of thing Extension stopped explaining once the audience changed. Now, let me tell you what I actually saw. In 2018, my Meyer Lemon 15-gallon pot, 4 years in that pot, sunny south-facing position, gave me 4 lemons. I'd been using a name brand citrus spike fertilizer, following the label exactly. Every 6 weeks during the growing season, stake in the soil, walk away. 4 lemons, I weighed them. I measured the bricks on my handheld refractometer. The fruit was fine. The reading was about 7.5, which is a perfectly acceptable lemon. Nothing to write home about. In 2019, I switched the tree onto the 1955 protocol. The first season was a transition season. I am not counting it. In 2020, after one full cycle on the new schedule, the same tree, same pot, same position in my yard, gave me 31 lemons. I have the notebook page open in front of me. 31. I ran the bricks on a sample of them. The average came in around 9.5, noticeably sweeter, better skin, heavier per fruit. I want to be honest with you. This was not a controlled experiment. It was the same tree, same pot, before and after, across 2 seasons. Your conditions might be different, but the difference between 4 and 31 is not subtle, and the numbers in the notebook do not lie. And it is exactly the kind of result that does not make it into the modern citrus spike label, because the modern label was not written for someone with one tree. There is one more layer to this, and it is the piece almost nobody talks about. The bulletin assumes you will heat the root zone before the first feeding. Specifically, in late winter, you wrap the pot in burlap and you move it to a south-facing wall. The wall absorbs sun during the day and re-radiates heat at night. The burlap holds it. What that does is push the root zone temperature above the 55-degree absorption threshold a couple of weeks earlier than it would otherwise get there. And that is the difference between a Phase A feeding that the tree can actually use and one that washes out the bottom of the pot. A commercial grower cannot do this. You cannot wrap 200,000 trees in burlap. You cannot move 200,000 trees to a south-facing wall. The technique is unworkable at scale, which is exactly why it was unworkable as an extension recommendation once Extension started writing for the people with 200,000 trees. The burlap detail is exactly the kind of small physical step that gets written out of a modern label. A label has to fit on a stake. The 1955 bulletin had 4 pages and it spent half a page on how to tie the burlap correctly. Nobody's printing that on a fertilizer spike. All right, before we get into why this protocol disappeared, I want to pause for a second. If what I just walked you through is making sense, phase-based feeding tuned to plant stage and root zone temperature, that is the same architecture I use on tomatoes, peppers, and squash. And it is the spine of Chapter 5 of my book, Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol. The chapter is called The 3-Phase Feeding Calendar. And the timeline diagram in there lays out establishment, flowering, and fruiting feedings for every crop in the garden. The book is $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're watching on your television, point your phone camera at the QR code on screen. If you're on a phone or laptop, the link is right in the description. Take your time pulling that up. No rush. I will be right here when you get back. This is written for folks who already grow food but suspect they are leaving real yield on the table. Now, the obvious question. If this protocol works, why is it not in the modern citrus literature? The answer is 1968 and the citrus consolidation. Up through the early 60s, California and Florida citrus was a fragmented industry, thousands of independent growers, lots of mid-size operations, a real diversity of practice. By the late 60s, that had collapsed. Sun-kissed and a small handful of grower cooperatives controlled most of the volume. And when production concentrates like that, the funding for agricultural research follows it. Extension services in the citrus states pivoted to serve the people who were now writing the checks. The mechanism is not sinister, it is just economic. A grower with 200,000 trees needs a fertilizer recommendation that can be applied through fertigation lines on a fixed schedule. He cannot send a person around to check soil temperature at every tree. He cannot wrap pots in burlap. He needs a single label that produces acceptable commercial fruit at scale. The 1955 protocol, the per tree. Temperature keyed, micronutrient aware version was unworkable for him. So Extension stopped publishing it. By around 1970, the backyard-tuned bulletins were gone from the active recommendations. I want to acknowledge the obvious counter-argument here because I think it is fair. Modern citrus fertilizers do work. They produce acceptable commercial fruit on commercial groves. I am not telling you the modern stuff is junk. I am telling you it was optimized for a different problem than the one you have. Acceptable for a 50-acre grove and optimal for a Meyer lemon in a 15-gallon pot are not the same outcome. The protocol that solved the second problem got abandoned because it could not solve the first. Here is the cost to you, sitting at home with one tree on the porch. Most backyard citrus owners are getting roughly 1/6 of the yield they could be getting. 4 lemons against 31. And they have been told implicitly by the labels and the catalogue descriptions that 4 to 8 is what container lemons do. It is not. That is what the abandoned protocol does. The protocol that did the rest is still there in a manila folder. All right, stay with me, because this is the piece the hook promised. The 14-day window the modern schedule completely skips, and where most of the extra fruit actually comes from. In my Zone 7A foothills, that window falls late February into the first week of March. The trigger is the day daytime temperatures first cross 55 degrees consistently, 3 or 4 days in a row, not a fluke afternoon. That is when flower bud differentiation begins inside the tree. The action is 1 feeding, 1 tablespoon of kelp meal, 1 teaspoon of bone meal, and a pinch of Epsom salt dissolved in warm water, applied to a root zone you have already moistened with plain water that morning. The pot has been wrapped in burlap and parked against a south-facing wall for at least a week before this, so the soil is above 55 degrees when you feed. Here is why it works. The tree is deciding flower count right now, before any visible bloom. If the phosphorus, the boron, and the magnesium are present at this exact moment, it sets a higher count. Modern schedules do not begin feeding until first visible bloom, 2 or 3 weeks after the decision has already been made. The year I added this single feeding to an otherwise modern routine, my flower count roughly tripled before I changed anything else. The notebook says it. That is where most of the 4 to 31 jump came from. The modern label has no instructions for this window because the commercial calendar does not include it. All right, before I let you go. Now you have the protocol, the 14-day window, the 3 phases, the burlap wrap. What you need next is the system to prove it works on your own tree, in your own conditions, with your own records. That is Chapter 2 of Steve's 30-day maximum yield protocol, the measurement foundation. It is the same notebook system I used to compare 4 lemons against 31, with 2 diagrams that show you exactly what to record and where to measure on the plant. The book runs 115 pages. You can find it at stevesgardenbooks.com, QR code on screen, link in the description. If you're on the TV, grab your phone and point it at the code. Take a moment. I will wait. So that is the buried piece. The 1955 protocol works because it tracks root zone temperature and the flower bud differentiation window. The modern schedule skips entirely. Now you have what Extension stopped publishing for backyard owners around 1970. Next time, we will dig into a Depression-era tomato method I tested in my own beds last summer. Same kind of story, different crop. All right, that's what I have for you today. I will see you in the next one.